Welcome back to the Cloudcast. I'm your host, Brian Gracely, and today we're going to dive into part two of our series looking at, how today's AI era is like some previous generations we've seen with computing not too long ago, to kind of look to compare and contrast it to where we are today, what looks the same, what looks different. How can we use our knowledge of history or things that have happened in the past to kind of give us some sense of maybe how the future will play out both in the short term and the long term. And also, sort of look at what was maybe unique and unusual in that time frame that, we may not see as something that gets repeated, again, here in, the newest era of AI. So, if we look back to the early 2010s, it's important to sort of ground ourselves in where were we, right? So, let's use 2010 as the starting point. We were, 2 years removed, a year and a half removed from the financial crisis of 2008, which was a global crisis, had huge impacts in terms of financial markets, in terms of, overall employment. Number of people unfortunately got laid off. Huge crash in the market. And what we really saw was a couple of interesting things. So from a corporate perspective, an enterprise perspective, a lot of focus on huge accountability of how are we spending money? A, do we have any money to spend? B, how are we going to go about spending that money? And C, we'd like to see, accountability in a much faster way maybe we had seen in the past, because, the overwhelming kind of sentiment at the time was, the crash happened, but there were warning signs for many years ahead of it that people kind of didn't pay attention to. And, in general, we kind of got lackadaisical about, just financial accountability, if you will. So on one hand, you've got this level of uncertainty going on in the global economy. And the second piece was you had the second piece that relates specifically to this is because of that lack of spending that was going on and just kind of an ongoing, feeling of, what was the general vibe in corporate IT and so forth, was a lot of frustration with corporate IT, right? There hadn't been a lot of net new technologies. I mean, virtualization was just sort of starting to take off as a whole. There hadn't been a whole lot of new technologies. And so there was a lot of frustration with corporate IT because it had become very stagnant, become very stale. It had become a group that, wasn't driven by being able to really kind of help drive innovation in businesses, but it really was there just to sort of be stable, say no to things. And so, you had a lot of lines of business and groups who were frustrated with corporate IT and were saying, look, we've got to find some alternatives because, the business is now looking for us to increase growth. There are opportunities that have come out of this financial crisis, and we need ways to take advantage of that. And then, the flip side was you had some very new technologies who'd come along. Mobile computing, Apple had launched the iPhone in 2007. So people were starting to get used to it. They were starting to create some new behaviors. We saw social media and sort of a connected, always on, always connected society, always on, always connected communities and so forth were going on. And so you had a lot of people who were starting to think about, what's possible with these technologies. And so there was a frustration with sort of corporate IT, right? So what's comes out of that obviously is this idea of on-demand computing, of cloud computing, which by 2010 is not a completely new idea, but for many people that concept making its way back into sort of enterprise IT was fairly new. And so it was sort of the right place at the right time in terms of what was going on in the economy, in terms of where people's frustration was versus looking for solutions. And then you had this whole new phenomenon going on in that everybody now had 24/7 access to the internet and to applications that could take advantage of the internet, could connect people, potentially connect buyers and sellers, markets, and so forth. And people were very interested in taking advantage of all that, right? So that's kind of the landscape that we're in early 2010. And the first thing I always highlight when I'm doing these things, or and we only highlight this once in a while because we only see a new generation of technology come along, once a decade, maybe, right? We had cloud computing in 2010. Mobile happened to be around the same time. Those were sort of coincidentally, happening at the same time, but they were very different. But one thing that we know is, and we know this, well, I should say this, what we've seen in the past is that every time there is a major transition from one previous generation of technology, of computing, if you will, to the next generation, the winner of that next generation is not necessarily, and it hasn't historically been the previous generation's winner, right? So, whether it was IBM in mainframes and minis, or whether it was Microsoft in the desktop and web, client server space, or whether it was, Apple and Google in, mobile, or Google and Facebook in sort of internet and search and all those sort of things, and ads and search and so forth. The winner has not necessarily been, the previous generation. And so Amazon comes along and sort of, I don't want to say from out of nowhere, but I don't think if you had asked somebody in 2005, like, who's going to be the 800-pound gorilla of the next computing generation, nobody would have said, Amazon, right? And, there's going to be stories written and case studies written about, why the behemoths at the time didn't see this, didn't become the next cloud computing company. So whether it was a HP or a Dell or an IBM or a Cisco or Oracle or, even Microsoft, why didn't they necessarily become what Amazon became in terms of offering, on-demand computing services, if you will? I mean, it wasn't as if they invented brand new technologies. They were offering servers and networking and storage. And yes, there was some uniqueness to them, but not distinctly uniqueness. They didn't invent the iPhone, right? They didn't invent mobile computing. They just offered the things that you did in a new way. So anyways, not a rant about AWS, but a little bit of a rant on, or introduction, that the companies that tend to win the next generation aren't necessarily the ones before, because again, they're not having to defend an existing business model. They're not having to defend existing quarter-to-quarter revenues to Wall Street the way that the other companies do, which can restrict their ability to really go all in on the next generation of innovation. So, but the things that we did see from that time that we're beginning to see a little bit of happening between what happened back then with cloud and what we're seeing with AI is a couple things that I wrote down. The first is, back then, because there really was sort of one centralized IT group, there was one organization that typically owned budgets, made decisions, created architectures, were kind of in charge of, technology for a corporation, was sort of centralized IT. And many companies then, as they do now in sort of the AI space, allowed that organization to set the rules for the entire organization. And in many cases, while they tried to be adaptive to different parts of the business, oftentimes, in order for them to drive consistency, they oftentimes created a lot of sort of one size fits all rules. And we're beginning to see this a little bit with AI as well, right? So obviously, corporations today are seeing AI be, a big possibility. It could be a possibility for their business. It could be an internal possibility for their workers to improve, to be more productive, whatever it might be. Opportunity for them to partner different, to work with the markets different. And in many cases, you're seeing kind of a similar pattern happen where, because it's new technology, because it's somewhat unknown technology, centralized groups are saying, we will sort of set the policy for what's going on. And these groups might still be centralized IT. They might be a center of excellence. They might be the CTO's office. But we're seeing, a number of companies who are saying, well, we have an AI policy. And the reason I bring this up is because what we saw back in the early cloud days was different groups within organizations basically said, well, that policy, that centralized approach, that one size fits all, doesn't fit what we need to do. And in the past, we had no access to these kind of new technologies, or these technologies that will allow us to experiment or try new things or get outside of your four walls. And, now they did. And so what we saw a lot of was what people called shadow IT. And I think we're going to see the beginning of, and it might be pervasive, it might not, shadow AI, in which groups say, hey, I know the company has a policy, and I know it's probably dictated in many cases by data governance. They don't want our data getting out there, our important business data, intellectual property, or, they're concerned about legal liability. We're creating something with AI that could open the company up to legal liability. And in many cases, groups will say, well, maybe that doesn't necessarily apply to me. Maybe I work in marketing, or I work in whatever the organization is that, doesn't feel like, hey, we're going to harm the company. We just have these deadlines that we have to meet. Maybe they're not even working on the AI projects, but they want to take advantage of AI. And so, we're already beginning to see sort of, again, this centralization approach to what companies should do. And then we're going to begin to, and we already started to see some, sort of shadow IT things start to happen. So that's the first thing that I think we're going to see parallelism between. The second thing is, we are starting to see, as we saw back in the day, we're starting to see executives who are, speaking with other executives. They're speaking with vendors. They're going to conferences. They're watching the news, and we're beginning to see many of them, make statements like, "We expect to apply AI to every aspect to our business." Or the other phrase that we're seeing quite a bit is, "We are going to have an AI first policy." Right. So the new technologies that we're going to advance for the company, we are going to, try and apply AI to those first. Sort of first and always, right? And again, we have seen this behavior before, in which we saw people say, "Hey, we have a cloud first policy. Everything new will go into the cloud." And again, what typically happens with that is these edicts come from places of hoping to try and improve the business. They've been exposed to some sort of data, some sort of examples, something that tells them that you are potentially going to get behind the market. You're going to get behind your competition. You need to accelerate what you're doing with this new technology. Again, in the past it was cloud, now it's AI. And without necessarily understanding all the ramifications of it or understanding the potential of it, sort of making a blanket statement and saying, "Hey, look, I'm going to sort of set a leadership tone and tell the company that, like, this is where we need to go." And what they're essentially saying is, like, look, it would be easy to try and think through everything, but that old way of thinking has kind of gotten us where we are today from a business perspective. We need to, I don't want to say throw it away, but we need to sort of get past it. The old way of doing things won't help us in the new way of doing things, that sort of mentality. And so you get a lot of this trickle down, cloud first or AI first. And what ends up happening is you're going to end up seeing a lot of companies who will, again, do this sort of fragmentation where they won't centrally dictate things. They'll allow lines of business and individual groups and individuals to kind of pick and choose. They will ultimately begin to, make some progress with those things. This will start to get socialized around the company. Those people will be sort of lauded as early successes of what's possible. Right? We saw this with cloud, where people were getting promoted. We saw cloud centers of excellence being built. We saw people getting promoted to be VP of cloud, or things along those lines. And then there wasn't necessarily the follow up or the ownership of those things, but it was very good in the first couple of years of trying to use this new technology as a way to drive change within your organization, which many cases could be good, but not necessarily think about it longer term than what was going to help you in the next 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, right? And we're starting to see some of those things happen as well. Like we're seeing people that realize, I'm going to be at the forefront of this, which is great. Every change needs people who are willing to be the leader, take the slings and arrows of the goods and the bads. But we're also starting to see people who are kind of doing the same thing that we saw, which was, we're going to be cloud first. We're going to measure ourselves in terms of how much we get into the cloud, right? Whether or not that was the right way to do it, the wrong way to do it. And what's interesting is I'm already starting to see from some friends and colleagues, some people I trust quite a bit, who they are starting to say, we need to be careful about the idea of AI first, because as we saw with cloud first, we put way more just sort of lift and shifted applications into the cloud. We didn't adjust them to work better in the cloud. We didn't adjust them to take advantage of the native capabilities of the cloud. We just sort of moved them from one location to another. Just like if you were to move in a house and you took a box out of your attic that you hadn't used in a while and just put it in the attic of your new house and then didn't use whatever was in that box. We've seen a lot of that. And then what ends up happening is companies realize, well, that was more expensive than I needed. It was more costly to maintain and all those types of things. So, what some of my friends and colleagues who are in this space, and they're specifically in the security space, are starting to say is, you know, be careful in terms of measuring your success as just, you know, are we new? What percentage of new are we, and how much are you really spending looking at how can we take advantage of what's new potential, like what to do something differently, and why is it different, and how can I take advantage of it? So, I think, if I were to just sort of summarize that, cloud native and sort of cloud migrated were very different things with very different results. And the companies that were truly sort of cloud native, right? We go back to the Netflix of the world and some of those things. Their ability to leverage the technology in new ways because they had new problems and they thought about what they were doing differently, it tended to create great results. The companies that did more of the cloud migrated, didn't take advantage of what was new, just tried to take the same old policies as before. They were the ones who, now are coming back and saying, cloud's too expensive. We need to cut back our cloud bill. Maybe they're talking about cloud patriation, whatever it might be. But the ones who were basically like, I didn't change my behaviors at all, but I expected different results. Right. So I think we're gonna see some of that because it's the natural behavior, right? It's the natural behavior of people to go, what's the shortcut? What's the least I can do to get the most benefit for myself? And so we're going to start to see some of those things as well. The other thing we're going to start to see is, we're going to see a whole ecosystem expand around this, and we're going to start to see people kind of make decisions about which one of these, approaches to AI works best, right? We're going to see an ecosystem revolve around the open AI ecosystem. We're going to see one around Google ecosystem. We'll see one around the open ecosystems, like what Llama's doing, or what Red Hat and IBM are doing, or what other companies are doing. And this is very, very natural. And it will be interesting to sort of watch who is building an ecosystem that accepts the community, and their partners and so forth, and can help make money for all of them, versus the ones who are sort of in the sort of winner take all game. Because these are patterns that we've seen in the past where, the ones who are best at, making $1 for themselves and $10 for the ecosystem that is attached to it, are the ones that tend to survive and last for a very long time, right? Microsoft was famous for this. VMware was famous for this, right? OpenAI has made some interesting statements lately about, all the people that are building just wrappers around the OpenAI API, you're probably going to get swallowed up sooner than later as just features within OpenAI. And that's fair too, right? Those are fair statements to make to your ecosystem of like, hey, there's not a lot of net value to this, but you do have to realize, like, am I going to build an ecosystem, or am I going to build everything myself? And this is where it really kind of gets into, do you have a legitimate business model to build everything yourself? Are you, reliant entirely on debt funding or VC funding? So I think, we are in such early days. It's going to be very interesting to watch that. It feels like there are early winners in the AI space, but it also feels like on any given week or any given month, there's enough drama in the AI space because it feels like there's so much at stake, whether it's at a personality level, like a Sam Altman, people shifting jobs from one place to another, or, big round of funding came in, or company that got a big round of funding went out of business, or, oh, this model is the best today. Oh, 2 months later, oh, this model is way better than the last model that looked like that last model. I feel like there's just so much uncertainty, and that part's going to be different than the cloud stuff, because for the cloud stuff, yes, there was a lot of things going on, but it took 3 or 4 years to sort out what it was. But for a long time, it was one company kind of dictating what that was. And yes, there's a little bit of it feels like, OpenAI is kind of dictating what's going on in some of the AI space, but it doesn't necessarily feel like they're driving it towards enterprise, right? Or towards corporate. They're driving it more towards consumer. So anyways, I think if we kind of boil all this stuff down, we're going to see some shadow AI. right? We're going to see the sort of breakaway of centralized. We're going to see a lot of interesting things happen around, how much do the governance of where data resides matters. In the cloud days, it didn't really seem to be that big a deal. It took a decade before that sort of caught up. We'll see whether that matters in the AI world. It feels like right now companies are much more concerned and stringent about where their data resides and whether their data should be part of AI models than they were in the early cloud days. So that feels different. And then it'll be very interesting to sort of see how much this sort of cloud first, AI first, approach kind of reappears, and does it learn anything from the last model, or does it continue to sort of, kind of just race forward, hair on fire, and then figure out the ramifications or the downside of it later. So, anyways, with that, I'll wrap it up. I think there are going to be some parallels to each one of the last couple of decades where we are with AI. There's going to be a ton of unknown. Who's going to win? What are the standards that are going to emerge? What role does money play in this in terms of funding? What role does open source play in terms of this, in terms of communities and sharing and all those types of things? Things that we didn't know at the beginning of the cloud era either. And they eventually made their way into being, positives or expansive or whatever they might be. So lots of still unknowns, obviously, but trying to draw at least a few parallels for you to think about in terms of how it might impact your day-to-day, how you do business, how you interact with your colleagues, how policies in your organization might get built, and so forth. So with that, I'll wrap it up. We'll be doing one more around sort of the 2020s and the generative AI era. I think we're going to focus a lot around, kind of the rush in funding and what all those things mean. And are we building unicorns? Are they sustainable unicorns? All that kind of stuff, just like we saw in the early 2000s. Hopefully, we won't have another pandemic era in 10 years with AI, but, knock on wood, hopefully those things won't happen again to us. So anyways, that'll wrap it up, and we'll talk to you next week. Thank you all for listening.